Nobody warned them it would feel like this. The empath who's finally awakening doesn't glow. They don't suddenly radiate peace and light and higher consciousness. What actually happens is far more unsettling. They go quiet. They pull back from people they have loved for years. They start saying no without explaining why. And everyone around them panics because the person who used to hold everything together has stopped holding anything at all. Carl Jung studied this transformation extensively, and what he found contradicted every popular narrative about spiritual awakening. He observed that when empaths truly awaken, they don't become more loving, more open, more available. They become more boundaried, more selective, more willing to let people experience the consequences of their own behavior. And this shift is so dramatic, so complete, that people who knew the empath before often can't reconcile the person standing in front of them with the one they used to know. Jung called this the individuation crisis of the empath. The moment when someone who has spent their entire life organizing their identity around other people's needs finally turns inward and discovers that almost nothing about their life actually belongs to them. Today I'm going to show you what Jung discovered happens during this awakening, why it destroys the empath's old life before it builds their new one. What specific psychological shifts occur that make the empath unrecognizable to the people who used to depend on them, and why this process, despite how terrifying it feels, is the healthiest thing an empath can ever go through. To understand what happens when an empath awakens, you first have to understand what they're waking up from. Jung didn't see empaths as naturally gifted healers who just needed better boundaries. He saw them as people whose entire psychological structure had been built around a lie, the lie that their worth came from what they could provide for others. This wasn't a belief they chose. It was a survival adaptation installed in childhood, usually so early that it became invisible, like water to a fish. The child who learned that love was conditional on caretaking, the kid who figured out that the only time they received positive attention was when they were managing someone else's emotional state, the one who discovered, before they had language for it, that their feelings didn't matter unless those feelings were in service of someone else's comfort. That child didn't grow up to become an empath by choice. They grew up to become an empath because their nervous system learned that selflessness was the price of survival. Jung found that this adaptation was extraordinarily effective in childhood. It kept the child safe, connected, necessary, but it came at a devastating cost that wouldn't reveal itself until decades later. The cost was the complete burial of the authentic self. Everything genuine about the empath, their real desires, their actual boundaries, their honest emotional responses, got pushed underground to make room for the performance of constant availability. And this performance became so seamless, so automatic, that the empath genuinely believed it was who they were. This is what makes the awakening so violent when it finally comes. Because the empath isn't just changing a behavior or adjusting a pattern. They're confronting the fact that the person they have been for 20, 30, 40 years was a construction, a survival strategy, a role they played so convincingly that they forgot they were playing it. And when that recognition hits, when they finally see the architecture of their own imprisonment, everything starts to collapse. Jung documented that the awakening typically begins with exhaustion that doesn't respond to rest. Not physical tiredness, but a bone-deep depletion that no amount of sleep, vacation, or self-care can touch. The empath had been running their system at maximum output for so long that the machinery starts breaking down. They can't keep absorbing. They can't keep giving. They can't keep performing the role of the person who holds everything together. Something inside them simply refuses to continue. Most empaths interpret this phase as depression, and from the outside, it looks like depression. They withdraw. They lose interest in relationships that used to be central to their lives. They stop responding to the emotional demands that used to activate them instantly. But Jung recognized this wasn't depression at all. It was the psyche beginning to reject a false operating system. The exhaustion wasn't pathology. It was the first sign of health. The organism was finally saying no after a lifetime of forced yes. What follows the exhaustion is what Jung called the shadow confrontation. And for empaths, this is uniquely devastating, because the empath shadow isn't filled with the obvious darkness, cruelty, selfishness, rage. Those are the things they've been taught to fear. The empath shadow contains something far more threatening to their identity. It contains their own needs, their genuine anger, their real opinions, their authentic desire to be left alone. The parts of themselves they sacrifice to maintain the illusion of selfless availability. When an empath begins to integrate their shadow, they don't become dark or cruel, they become honest. And that honesty is so foreign to the people around them that it registers as hostility. The empath who finally says, "I don't want to listen to your problems right now," gets treated like they've committed an act of violence. The empath who stops calling to check in on everyone gets accused of not caring. The empath who chooses their own needs over someone else's comfort gets labeled selfish by people who benefited from their selflessness. Jung observed that this phase is where most empaths either complete their awakening or retreat back into the old pattern, because the social punishment for authenticity is severe. Everyone who depended on the empath's endless availability experiences their awakening as abandonment. And the empath, who spent their entire life terrified of being perceived as selfish, faces the thing they fear most: being seen as someone who doesn't care. The temptation to go back to performing, to resume the role, to quiet the accusations by becoming the old self again, is enormous. But Jung found that empaths who push through this phase, who endure the social fallout and continue honoring what's emerging inside them, undergo a transformation so complete that he described it as a psychological death and rebirth. The person who existed before doesn't survive, not because they're destroyed, but because they were never real to begin with. What dies is the performance. What dies is the compulsive caretaking. What dies is the identity built entirely around being needed. And what emerges is something the empath has never experienced before: themselves. If you've been feeling this pull inward, this refusal your body is staging against the life you built while asleep, that's not breakdown. That's the beginning of becoming who you actually are. Our new guide, True Self-Discovery, offers 24 practical reflection exercises rooted in Carl Jung's teachings, designed to help you find your way through exactly this kind of unraveling. Click below to get True Self-Discovery, and let's continue. The first thing that changes when an empath truly awakens is their perception of relationships. Jung called this the dissolution of projected identity. The moment when the empath stops seeing people through the lens of what those people need and starts seeing them through the lens of what's actually true. This shift is disorienting because the empath suddenly recognizes dynamics that were invisible to them before. They see that certain friendships were never mutual, that the person who called every week wasn't checking on them, They were downloading their problems onto the only person who would absorb without complaint. That the family member who praised their sensitivity was actually praising their compliance. This recognition isn't intellectual, it's visceral. The empath feels it in their body, a combination of grief and rage that can be overwhelming. Grief for the years they spent pouring into connections that were never reciprocal. Rage at themselves for not seeing it sooner. And underneath both, a terrible clarity that can't be unfelt. They've been used, not maliciously in most cases, but structurally. The system around them was organized to extract their energy, attention, and emotional labor. And they participated willingly because they believed that was love. Jung emphasized that this recognition is where the empath's real healing begins. Not in learning to set boundaries, that comes later, but in allowing themselves to feel the full weight of what was taken from them and what they gave away. Most empaths skip this grief because it feels self-pitying. They want to jump straight to forgiveness, understanding, compassion for the people who use them. But Jung warned that premature forgiveness is just another form of bypassing. You have to feel the anger before you can genuinely release it. Otherwise, you're just performing forgiveness the same way you perform selflessness, to avoid the discomfort of your real emotions. The second shift Jung documented was the reclamation of energy. Once the empath stops automatically distributing their attention and emotional resources to everyone around them, something remarkable happens. They discover they have energy they didn't know existed. Not just physical energy, but creative energy, intellectual energy, emotional energy that had been siphoned away for so long they forgot it was theirs. Tasks that used to exhaust them become manageable. Ideas that never had room to develop suddenly start flowing. The fog that they thought was just how their brain worked begins to lift. Jung described this as the return of libido, not in the sexual sense, but in the broader psychological sense of life force. The empath's vitality had been distributed across dozens of relationships and obligations that drained without replenishing. When those drains are closed, the energy that floods back is almost disorienting. Empaths in this phase often describe feeling more alive than they have in years, sometimes decades. They start projects. They make decisions they've been postponing. They experience desire, genuine, selfish, unapologetic desire for things that serve no one but themselves. The third transformation is what Jung found most significant and what makes the awakened empath genuinely powerful. He called it the integration of discernment. Before awakening, the empath sensitivity operated without a filter. Every emotion, every energy, every unspoken need in their environment registered with equal intensity. They couldn't distinguish between their feelings and someone else's. They couldn't separate genuine distress from manufactured guilt. They were a receiver with no tuning mechanism, picking up every signal indiscriminately. After awakening, the sensitivity doesn't diminish, it sharpens. But now, it operates through the empath's integrated consciousness rather than their wounded one. They can still feel everything. They still perceive the layers beneath surface interactions, still read the room with extraordinary accuracy. But they're no longer compelled to act on every perception. They can feel someone's pain without rushing to fix it. They can sense manipulation without being hooked by it. They can recognize dysfunction without believing it's their job to repair it. This is what makes the awakened empath so different from who they were before. Their sensitivity, which used to be a wound that everyone exploited, becomes a tool for navigating reality with precision. Jung observed that empaths who completed this integration developed judgment that seemed almost supernatural. They could assess people and situations with breathtaking accuracy because their perceptual ability was now operating in service of their own wisdom rather than everyone else's needs. But Jung also documented the cost of this awakening, and he was honest about how steep it is. The empath who awakens will lose relationships, not might lose, will lose, because the relationships built on the old dynamic cannot survive the new one. People who love the empath's availability will experience their boundaries as rejection. Family members who depended on the empath's emotional labor will feel abandoned. Friends who were accustomed to being the priority will resent being one of many. And the empath will grieve every single one of these losses, even the ones they know are necessary. Jung found that this grief is one of the most underestimated aspects of empath awakening. People focus on the empowerment, the strength, the liberation, but the loss is real and it's substantial. The empath is mourning not just specific relationships, but an entire way of being in the world. They're mourning the comfort of being needed, which was dysfunctional but familiar. They're mourning the simplicity of knowing their role, even if that role was slowly killing them. They're mourning the version of themselves that everyone loved, the compliant, available, endlessly giving version, because that version, despite being a prison, was also a home. Jung was clear that empaths who try to skip this grief, who jump straight to celebrating their transformation without honoring what was lost, end up cycling back into old patterns. The grief has to be felt completely. The loss has to be acknowledged as real, because only by mourning the old self fully can the new self take root in solid ground rather than in denial. What emerges on the other side of this mourning is what Jung considered one of the most psychologically complete states a person can achieve. The awakened empath has done something most people never do. They've dismantled an entire identity structure, faced the shadow material beneath it, endured the social consequences of authenticity, grieved the life built on a false foundation, and rebuilt from the ground of who they actually are, rather than who they were trained to be. This person moves through the world differently. They're not cold, they're selective. They're not uncaring. They're honest about what they're willing to carry. They love more deeply than before because they're choosing to love rather than compulsively caretaking. Their relationships are fewer, but they're real, built on mutual seeing rather than one-sided service, built on truth rather than performance. Jung noted that awakened empaths often become uncomfortable for the people still operating from unconscious patterns. Not because the empath does anything confrontational, but because their presence reveals what's inauthentic. The awakened empath isn't performing anymore, and that non-performance makes other people's performances visible by contrast. People sense this. They can't always articulate what changed, but they feel exposed around the awakened empath in ways they didn't before. This is why some people withdraw from the empath after their transformation, not because the empath pushed them away, but because authenticity is threatening to those who haven't faced their own masks. If you're in the middle of this process right now, if relationships are falling away and the person you used to be feels like a stranger, understand that what you're experiencing isn't loss, it's correction. Your life is reorganizing around who you actually are instead of who you were performing to be. And that reorganization, as painful as it is, will eventually create something your old life never could have given you. A sense of belonging that doesn't require you to abandon yourself to maintain it. Jung spent decades watching empaths go through this awakening. He watched them resist it, surrender to it, grieve through it, and emerge from it transformed. And his conclusion was always the same. The empath's awakening is not a spiritual luxury or an emotional indulgence. It is a psychological necessity. Because the empath who never awakens spends their entire life serving a role they didn't choose, maintaining relationships built on extraction rather than reciprocity, and slowly suffocating under the weight of an identity that was never theirs. The awakening breaks that pattern permanently, not by making the empath less sensitive, but by returning their sensitivity to its rightful owner. The empath finally gets to experience their own depth, their own perception, their own extraordinary capacity for feeling, directed inward for the first time, directed toward their own life, their own healing, their own becoming. And that redirection, which everyone around them experiences as loss, is actually the empath arriving home for the first time in their life. Jung would tell you that this process cannot be rushed, cannot be shortcut, and cannot be completed without real pain. But he would also tell you that every empath who makes it through to the other side says the same thing. They wouldn't go back. Not to the old relationships, not to the old role, not to the version of themselves that everyone loved, but that was slowly disappearing under the weight of everyone else's needs. The person they've become, boundaried, discerning, selective, honest, whole, is worth everything it costs to get here. That's what happens when an empath finally awakens. Not transcendence, not enlightenment, something more radical than either. They become real. And real, after a lifetime of performing, is the most powerful thing they've ever been. If you're walking through this awakening right now, if the ground beneath your old life is shifting and you're searching for something solid to stand on, our new guide, True Self-Discovery, was built for exactly this moment. 24 reflection exercises inspired by Carl Jung's teachings, designed to help you find your way within when everything outside is changing. Click below to get True Self-Discovery.